I knew something was wrong the moment the trees began to whisper. Not in words, no, but in the way their leaves shifted, not with the wind, but with intention. The way a crowd leans in before the executioner raises his axe. The way a wolf tilts its ears before it pounces. It was dusk. The last rays of sunlight spilled through the forest canopy in long amber streaks, and the path beneath my feet had turned from dirt to damp moss to something softer. Something like breath held too long, or footsteps erased by fear. No birds, no rustling critters. Even the insects had gone still. And yet, I kept walking, because the letter had said, "Report to the fortress." Because the messenger had not waited for a reply. Because refusing a summons from Vlad the Impaler, Prince of Wallachia, was a quicker death than anything the forest might offer. The trees leaned closer, I swear it. Their trunks, twisted like old bones, formed arches above the trail. And I realized, this wasn't a road, it was a throat, and I was being swallowed. You wouldn't survive this, because you'd stop to ask where you were. You'd raise your voice. You'd hope someone might answer. But in these woods, answers are dangerous, and questions bleed. I passed a clearing where the grass had grown in thick patches, except in the center, where nothing grew at all. I saw the earth was blackened, and in it, a rotted wooden stake still stood upright, like a finger pointing at the heavens. There was a smear of something down its length. Sap, I told myself. Old resin. Not dried blood. Of course not. But I kept walking faster. The night came quickly, as if someone had snuffed out the sun by hand. And the cold followed, creeping through the seams of my coat, clinging to my ribs, gnawing on my fingers like a hungry dog. I wasn't alone anymore. Not really. I hadn't seen anyone. But I felt eyes. Eyes behind bark. Eyes between roots. Eyes that had once belonged to men, and now belonged only to the forest. They watched not to help me, but to judge how long I'd last. There were stories. Stories I'd grown up hearing, whispered between mouthfuls of stale bread. Of impaled merchants who had haggled. Of monks who prayed with the wrong tone. Of lovers who kissed without permission. Of courtiers who bowed too slowly. And of course, of the prince himself, Vlad Draculaea, son of the dragon, voivode of punishment, patron of silence. They said he drank among the impaled, that he watched his enemies twitch while he dipped bread in their blood. But I had laughed then. Because they were just stories. Because grown-ups love to scare children. Because no one really lives like that. Right? Right? The path climbed now. Jagged stones jutted from the earth, scraping the soles of my boots. The trees thinned, barely. And then I saw it, atop a distant ridge, its silhouette cut from black silk. The fortress. No torches burned in its windows. No banners flapped in the wind. It just sat there, watching me, as if it had been waiting, not just for tonight, but for all the years I had thought myself safe. And suddenly I knew I hadn't been summoned. I had been selected. You wouldn't survive this, because you believe in borders. Between forest and fortress, between stories and truth, between cruelty and myth. But here, everything blurs. Here the trees carry tales in their roots. The stones remember the names of the dead. And the silence. It listens. The road curled like a noose around the mountain. Every step I took felt heavier. Not from exhaustion, though I was tired, but from something else. Something deeper. Like the ground itself didn't want me to reach the top. Like gravity wasn't just physics here. It was fear. The castle loomed larger now. Its walls weren't grand or majestic. They were brutal, functional, built not to impress, but to resist. Black stones stacked like clenched fists, each one darker than the sky behind it. No banners, no guards standing proud, just narrow slits in the tower walls, watching me like eyes that had seen too much. There was no path past it, no village below to return to, no horses waiting by the road, just the castle, just me, and the wind, which had gone cold and silent. When I finally reached the gate, I realized it had no handles, no bell, no knocker, just an iron door, sealed shut, tall enough to swallow a man and heavy enough to forget him. So I waited, and waited. No one came. You might have knocked, you might have called out, but you don't knock on the gates of Vlad the Impaler. You're let in, or you're left to rot. After a long while, I heard the sound, not a voice, not footsteps, just the deep, bone-dragging groan of the gate as it slowly pulled inward. No one on the other side. Just a yawning black hallway beyond. It didn't invite. It devoured. Still, I stepped in, because to wait outside was to be seen, and to be seen was worse than to be judged. The doors slammed shut behind me, hard. The sound echoed through the stone walls like a gunshot in a crypt, and just like that, I was inside. You wouldn't survive this, because you need context, because you expect signs, because you believe there's a line between truth and theater, between horror and ceremony. But here, fear isn't a side effect. It's the policy. The hallway stretched ahead, narrow and tall. Torches flickered from iron brackets, but their flames were weak, as if they feared burning too brightly. The light danced across damp stone and old scars, scratches along the walls, as if someone had tried to hold on while being dragged away. I tried not to look too long. Every few steps, I passed a door, some open, some sealed. Behind one, I heard what sounded like whispering. Behind another, nothing at all. The third was breathing. I'm sure of it. But no guards, no attendants, just the hall, just the stone, just the silence. At the far end stood a staircase, winding up and disappearing into darkness. A small man waited at the base of it, wearing a gray tunic and no expression. He didn't speak. He didn't even nod. He just turned and began walking, and I followed. Upward, into the belly of the fortress. Each step creaked beneath our feet, stone on stone like teeth grinding. No paintings, no windows, no comforts. This wasn't a palace, it was a punishment. At last, the staircase ended at a long corridor, lined with heavy doors. The man pointed to the one at the end, then turned and left me. Just like that. I didn't ask questions. I didn't call him back. Because deep down, I already knew the answer. This was where he wanted me. You wouldn't survive this. Because you'd ask who he was. Because you'd think this story needed a twist, a moment of doubt, a chance to escape. But Vlad doesn't offer escape. Only entrance. Only obedience. Only outcomes. The final door opened on its own. Inside, the room was lit by a single candle. A long stone table stood at the center. And at its far end, silhouetted by the dim flame, sat a man. He didn't speak. He didn't look up. But I knew who he was, not from portraits or paintings, but from the weight in the room, from the way my knees softened, from the feeling that if I breathed too loud, I'd never breathe again. Vlad the Impaler, Voivode of Wallachia, my host. He raised a finger, and without a word, I sat. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence that surrounded him wasn't merely the absence of sound, but a kind of presence all its own. Dense, pressing, like smoke that had learned to settle in the lungs of a man long before he ever inhaled it. And I, seated at the far end of the long bare stone table, felt as though I had wandered into the eye of a storm that hadn't yet begun to move, but could, at any moment, with terrible precision. His figure was lean but taut, like a wire pulled too tight. He sat not like a ruler accustomed to luxury, but like a blade kept in its sheath too long. Waiting, the candle between us, its flame trembling slightly in the stale air, cast long dancing shadows across the table's rough surface. The flicker would catch on his cheekbones, high and sharp, or glint briefly in the black of his eyes that didn't blink, didn't flinch, and certainly didn't look away. They were studying me, not with curiosity, but with calculation, as if weighing something. Not my value, but my limits. You wouldn't survive this, because you'd try to read the room, to smile, to nod, to play polite. But this room doesn't reward manners. It rewards stillness, and the silence that doesn't ask for understanding, only obedience. I didn't speak either, because I wasn't here to talk. I was here because someone, somewhere, had spoken in my place. Perhaps I had displeased the wrong merchant. Perhaps I had looked too long at someone in the market. Or perhaps I had simply been noticed. Sometimes in Wallachia, being noticed was enough. Vlad raised a hand, slowly, with the kind of calm that doesn't soothe, but threatens, like a curtain lifting before a horror no one dares name. A servant emerged from the shadows. I hadn't heard a door. I hadn't heard a step. But suddenly, he was there, placing a single object on the table between us. A goblet. Simple. Black. Empty. No words. No gesture of invitation. Just a test, or a signal, or perhaps both. I didn't touch it. I didn't reach. I didn't breathe more than I needed, because I'd heard the stories about the noble who had drunk before being told, about the trader who had left wine in his cup, about the soldier who had dared to toast. None of them were seen again. Or if they were seen differently, more vertical, less living. Vlad finally spoke, not with loudness, but with the kind of softness that forces you to lean in, and in doing so, give something away. Do you know why you are here? The question sat in the air like a blade laid gently on skin, not cutting. Not yet. But aware that it could, I swallowed, carefully, measuredly. No, I said. And I meant it, because how could I? How could anyone understand the logic of a man who ruled not with gold nor with armies, but with the steady certainty that fear itself was a form of governance more effective than any law? He nodded once, in a motion so small I almost missed it. That is better, he said, and I couldn't tell whether he meant better than lying, or better than knowing. You wouldn't survive this, because you'd try to find meaning, to make sense of what you see, to fit it into a shape that feels familiar. But there's no shape here, only edges. Then, without a word, he stood. The chair didn't scrape, the table didn't creak. Only the candle trembled, as if his movement had disturbed something deeper than air. He walked past me, slowly, and as he did, I felt the weight of him. Not his body, but his presence, like iron passing over silk. He didn't dismiss me. He didn't threaten. He simply left, and the door behind him closed, not with violence, but with finality. I sat there for a long time, not because I didn't know what to do, but because I did. I had just met a man who did not rule through power. He ruled through precision, through memory, through the knowledge that fear once planted grows even in silence, and mine had already taken root. They led me through the corridor without a word. Not with cruelty, not with haste, but with that same stillness I had come to recognize as far more dangerous than any display of rage. The torchlight shifted with every step, painting long shadows on the walls, shadows that didn't look like ours. Some were taller, distorted by the irregular surfaces. Some, I swear, moved even when we didn't. The floor was stone, cold and slightly damp beneath my thin shoes, though I barely noticed it anymore. My focus narrowed as we passed a door unlike the others, thicker, rimmed with iron, stained dark near the bottom. That one they did not open. That one they passed with their heads lowered ever so slightly, a gesture not of respect, but of avoidance. Even monsters, I thought, have their monsters. The man in front of me, still silent, stopped beside a tall door fitted with thick iron hinges and small copper studs. He did not knock. He did not announce me. He simply pushed the door open, then stood aside with the same dead-eyed patience that had followed me since the gate. I stepped in alone. The room was lit not by torches, but by oil lamps set high into the corners, casting a yellow glow that fell more like a fever dream than actual light. The walls were covered in wooden panels, the only room I'd seen so far not made of stone. But these panels weren't smooth or polished. They were covered in nails, thousands of them, long, thin, and driven halfway in, as though waiting for something, or someone, to press against them. They covered every inch of wood. The floor was the same. Flat boards, but with tiny points embedded at irregular intervals, forcing you to watch every step unless you wanted to bleed. And in the center of the room, beneath the wavering lamplight, stood a chair. At first it looked ordinary. 4 legs, straight back, solid frame. But the longer I looked, the more wrong it became. Its seat was studded with rusted spikes, each one polished at the tip, as though often used and rarely cleaned. The back had leather straps hanging limp like dead vines, and beneath it, bolted to the floor, was a drain. Small, dark, hungry. You wouldn't survive this, because your mind would race to explain. You'd tell yourself it's for criminals. You'd hope it's only symbolic. You'd believe, desperately, that this was once used, but not anymore. But Vlad doesn't keep relics. He keeps instruments, and everything in this castle is still in tune. The man who had escorted me did not enter. He stood just outside, eyes vacant. Behind me, I heard another figure arrive. I didn't turn. I didn't have to. The room shifted when he stepped in, as though the shadows themselves made space for him. He moved past me and walked to the chair, not to sit, but to inspect it, running one gloved finger across the seat, checking for something. Not dust, not wear, perhaps intention. Then he looked at me. Vlad. Sit, he said. One word, software precise. I didn't move, not out of defiance. No, never that. But because my legs had gone hollow, like reeds blown clean by wind. Do you believe you are innocent? He asked, and the question cut more deeply than any blade, because it wasn't rhetorical, because it demanded something real, and because there was no safe answer. I swallowed. Does it matter? A pause, a long one. Then, to my shock, he smiled. Not a wide grin, not a mask, just the faintest curl at the edge of his mouth. A shadow of approval. No, he said, it does not. He didn't make me sit. Not that day. Instead, he walked to the wall, tapped one of the panels, and waited. A small section clicked open, revealing a hidden niche with a book inside. A thick, leather-bound ledger stained at the edges. He opened it slowly, leafing through pages already full of names. I saw one, half crossed out. I saw another, underlined. Then he found the page he wanted, and without looking at me, he spoke again. "You will remain here," he said, "until I decide otherwise." The ledger closed, the panel sealed, and he walked out. You wouldn't survive this, because you'd scream, you'd bang on the door, you'd plead for justice, for clarity, for anything human. But here, your voice is a tool, and Vlad has no use for tools that talk. The door didn't lock with a click. It locked with silence, the kind that seals not just the room, but the idea that anything outside of it still cares what happens within. And as I stood there surrounded by nails and shadows, I began to understand something far worse than fear. I understood permanence, because Vlad doesn't punish to teach. He punishes to shape. And I had just entered the mold. Morning came, but it didn't arrive with the softness you might expect. No golden light gently brushing against windowsills. No birdsong to remind you that life went on. No warm breeze to hint that outside these walls, the world still turned. It came instead like a verdict. Cold, gray, final. The kind of morning that doesn't promise renewal, but instead makes clear that yesterday's terror was no dream, and today may simply be worse. The sun, if it had risen at all, hid behind a veil of wet clouds. Its light barely filtered through the slit in the wall that passed for a window. I say slit because it was no more than that. A vertical wound carved into stone, wide enough to permit a whisper of wind, but never an escape. And the wind that came was thin and sour, like it had already passed through someone else's fear. I hadn't slept, not in any way that counted. I had closed my eyes. I had counted breaths. I had tried to fold my thoughts into something small and safe, but this place didn't permit safety. Not in thought, not in posture, not in dreams. When the door opened, it did so without warning. No knock, no voice, just the creak of hinges that hadn't yet rusted, because even decay moved too slowly in this place to keep up with function. A man stepped in. No, not stepped. He entered like a shadow choosing to become flesh. Tall, hooded, silent. And in his hands, he held not food, not chains, but a brush. A long-handled, stiff-bristled brush, and a bucket. Without speaking, he walked past me to the far corner of the room, dipped the brush into the bucket, and began to scrub. That's when I smelled it. Blood. Old. Dried. But blood all the same. And in that moment, I realized something that made my stomach twist tighter than any knot I'd known. This wasn't just a cell. This was a space with turnover, with routine, with a cleaning schedule. You wouldn't survive this, because you'd still think this place was about punishment. But punishment implies a path back to forgiveness. This place wasn't about correction. It was about memory. The man scrubbed in silence, as if the stains he attacked weren't physical, but reputational, proof of something that should not have happened here, or at least should not have lingered. He didn't look at me once. Not when he arrived, not as he worked, not even when he left. And when the door closed behind him, it felt heavier than it had before. I stood motionless in the middle of the room, wondering how many had stood in this exact spot before me, wondering how many had made it to the morning after. And then came the horn, a single, low blast from beyond the tower. Not celebratory, not militaristic. It wasn't the sound of something starting, but something concluding. A judgment, a sentence, an execution. They marched them past the tower an hour later. 3 of them, dirty, barefoot, hands bound behind their backs with coarse rope that bit into their wrists like the teeth of small, invisible wolves. Their faces were tight, not with fear, but with the numbness of men who had already accepted something no one should ever have to accept. One of them looked up, just once, toward the tower. He didn't see me, but I saw him, and in his expression there was no plea, no rage, no defiance, just a kind of tragic resignation, the kind that comes when a man realizes his story won't be told, and even if it is, it won't be believed. Behind them came the guards, stoic, expressionless. One of them carried a pole with a small hook on the end. Another carried something wrapped in cloth. A hammer. You wouldn't survive this. Not because you couldn't handle the fear. Not because you'd scream or collapse or beg. But because your soul would break at the idea that this machinery of death wasn't personal. It was protocol. From the tower window, I couldn't see the field where they were taken, but I could hear. The sound wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. The wet, sudden sound of something giving way, then silence, then birds, then nothing. No cries, no speeches, no declarations. Just a brief moment with a world paused, and then carried on as if nothing had happened at all. That, I think, was the worst part. Not the act, but how normal it had become. I sat on the floor of the chamber, my back against the wall of cold stone, and let my head fall into my hands. My thoughts no longer raced. They no longer even walked. They simply drifted, like ash in the air after a fire that no one bothered to put out. Because here, survival isn't about resisting. It's about forgetting who you were before the silence began. And I was already forgetting. They told me we were going for a walk. Just like that. A walk. As if the days and nights of captivity hadn't made my legs forget how to carry me without trembling. As if this wasn't the kind of place where walks ended in silence. Or worse, applause. But I said nothing. I stood when ordered, followed when prompted, and tried not to look behind me in case that simple act was considered suspicion or disrespect or something even worse. Defiance. 2 guards flanked me. Neither spoke. Their boots struck the stone floor with dull certainty, echoing through the narrow passage like ceremonial drums. I noticed then that the air had changed. It no longer smelled of damp stone or oil smoke, but of something older, earthier. There was dirt in the air, real dirt, not dust, and pine, and something sharp underneath that I couldn't name until we passed through the gate. It was blood. Faint. Faded. But still there, like the soil itself remembered. You wouldn't survive this, because your hope would rise. You'd smell the open air and think, for a moment, you were going home. But here the outdoors is not for freedom. It's for display. The forest was just beyond the castle grounds. Not a forest, really. More a jagged halo of trees that surrounded a wide, sloping field. A place where silence and spectacle had learned to share space. The grass was patchy and yellowed, beaten down by too many feet. The trees themselves bent slightly inward, as if bowing, not to a ruler, but to memory. And then I saw them. The stakes. Hundreds of them. No, thousands. Driven deep into the earth in careful rows. Not like a battlefield, but like a garden. A perverse symmetry. Each stake was slightly different. Some taller, some blackened by time, others newer, as if the craft had not been lost, but refined. And on some, still hung bodies. You wouldn't survive this, not just because of what you'd see, but because of how still everything is. The dead don't move, but the wind does. And when it does, the ropes creak. The cloth flutters. and something inside you tears a little, because you realize how many of them were never named, and how many of them weren't meant to be. They brought me to a small rise at the edge of the clearing, where the forest gave way to a kind of open amphitheater. No seats, just mud and grass and stone. I stood there, not bound, not beaten, just watched, observed. Vlad stood not far ahead, his figure barely moving, as if the entire display meant nothing to him anymore. He didn't smile, he didn't scowl. He simply raised one hand, and a man, hooded, trembling, was dragged forward by 2 soldiers. The stake beside him was new, smooth, sharpened, prepared, and what happened next wasn't rushed. It wasn't brutal, at least not in the way you'd expect. It was methodical, deliberate, a ritual, and when it was done, there was no scream, only breathing, labored, wet, but alive, because that's the point. The impalement wasn't about killing, it was about extending death until it became indistinguishable from existence. I turned away, not because I was afraid, but because I felt shame. Shame that I could still stand, that I could still breathe, that some twisted part of me felt relief that it wasn't me. And Vlad saw that. I know he did, because when he turned toward me, he didn't look angry. He looked satisfied, as if the forest had done its work again, not on the condemned, but on the witness. You wouldn't survive this, because we're not built to carry so much horror without leaking, not from the eyes, but from the soul. When we returned to the castle, no one spoke. The guards didn't even watch me. They didn't have to. They knew the forest would follow me, into my room, into my sleep, into the place where words go before they become thoughts. Because once you've seen it, you carry it, not like a memory, but like a stain. And stains don't fade, they sink. They summoned me with no words, just a knock on the cell door, a flick of the hand from a guard I'd never seen before, and the cold implication that refusing to follow would not be wise. So I walked, my feet bare against stone, heartbeat louder than the footsteps of the man leading me. The air in these corridors never seemed to change. Always damp, as though the castle breathed out the cold and inhaled fear in return. They said I'd been invited to dinner, but nothing here was ever so simple. The hall I entered was unlike any room I'd seen before. Long, cavernous, arched with black timber beams stretching like ribs above us. The walls were decorated not with tapestries, but with weaponry. Halberds, swords, spears, even whips, all gleaming in the candlelight. A fire roared in a stone hearth, and its smoke curled toward an opening in the ceiling, escaping as if trying to flee what it had witnessed. And there, at the far end of a long wooden table, sat Vlad. You wouldn't survive this, because you'd think the rules of dining still applied. He didn't smile. He didn't stand. He simply nodded toward the chair to his right. Not a request, an instruction. I sat. Others were already present, men in silks and furs, their faces stiff with forced calm. Their eyes moved little. No one spoke. The table was covered with roasted meats, stewed fruits, loaves of dark bread, bowls of pomegranate seeds glistening like droplets of blood. The kind of feast one might expect at a royal wedding, except for the silence. A thick, living thing that pressed against the skull, as if even breath should be rationed. Vlad raised his goblet. Everyone else did too. I followed carefully, letting the rim touch my lips, but tasting nothing. I wasn't here to enjoy myself. I was here to be watched. You wouldn't survive this, because your instincts would betray you. The man to my left trembled as he cut a piece of meat. His knife scraped the plate, too loudly. I saw Vlad's eye twitch, just once, but the man went pale. He lowered the knife. He didn't eat again. From the shadows behind us, servants emerged like ghosts. Young, pale-faced, eyes down. They cleared plates silently, replaced them with new ones. A delicate pastry, shaped like a swan. I stared at it, unsure whether to eat. Unsure whether not eaten would be worse. Vlad finally spoke. "One must be careful," he said, voice quiet but sharp, "of what one consumes." The room froze. Every man stiffened, posture straightened, fingers froze halfway to lips. No one replied. No one dared. The words weren't meant to be answered. They were bait. Traps with no teeth. Only silence as punishment. The man to Vlad's left chuckled nervously. A single breath of a laugh. Wrong move. Vlad did not look at him. He simply raised a finger. 2 guards appeared. They moved with the precision of trained dogs, grabbing the man by the arms and lifting him from his chair. He said nothing. There was no struggle, just a glance toward me, one final flicker of shared helplessness, before they dragged him away through a side door. You wouldn't survive this, because you'd assume the worst was over. But in this court, dread lingers even after the blood dries. The dinner continued as if nothing had happened. No one filled the empty chair. It remained a silent space, a reminder. The next course arrived, slices of duck in a sauce that smelled like wine and copper. I ate without tasting. My hands moved as if by instinct, each motion measured, deliberate, rehearsed in the theater of fear. I wanted to be invisible, but Vlad looked at me. Not long, not with anger, just curiosity, like a child watching a beetle crawl over his boot, wondering how many legs it had before crushing it. He said nothing else that evening. He didn't need to. When the dinner ended, no one stood until he did. Then all rose as one, backs straight, heads bowed. He left first, then the others in silence, a procession of well-dressed corpses filing out into the dim corridors of the castle. A guard escorted me back to my cell. This time, the door was not locked, just closed. I sat on the floor, knees to chest, watching the single candle in the wall sconce burn low. And I wondered, was this what mercy looked like? To be left alive, untouched, unnamed, but not unseen. You wouldn't survive this, because the silence at that table isn't absence of sound. It's the presence of judgment. And in Vlad's presence, judgment is always hungry. They told me it was a garden. That word, garden, echoed strangely in my mind. I'd almost forgotten what it meant. In my world, gardens had once been things of peace, sunlight warming ripe figs, the hum of bees between lavender stalks, a breeze that smelled of soil and fruit. But here, in this place ruled by silence and steel, the word felt foreign, corrupted, something shaped into irony rather than truth. A soldier brought me there at dawn, not to walk, not to rest, but to see. You wouldn't survive this, because the word garden would disarm you. It would make you expect relief. Instead, it delivers permanence. The iron garden was not inside the walls. It lay just beyond the outer ramparts, flanked by a stone path that curled like a scar around the castle's belly. The air smelled of dew and rust. At first, I thought we were heading toward an execution ground, but no gallows stood, no guillotine, just rows upon rows of metal. It wasn't until I stepped closer that I understood. The stakes were not of wood, they were of iron, twisted, forged, weather-worn. Each one stood driven deep into the ground like a black flower in bloom. But they weren't empty. They held names, thousands of them. You wouldn't survive this, because names are meant for remembrance, but here they're used for shame. Each iron stalk bore a plate, some large, others barely hanging on by rusted wire. Names etched in hurried strokes or careful script. Some were scratched out and rewritten. Others were blank, as if awaiting someone still alive. And then I saw mine. Not the full name, just the first letter, carved sloppily. Fresh, it gleamed in the morning light. I stepped back instinctively, but the soldier beside me didn't move, didn't explain, didn't even glance at it, because he didn't need to. The message was clear. This garden grows. There were no bodies here. Not anymore. But the silence felt heavier than any corpse, as if the ground itself was swollen with memory. There were footprints between the rows, paths worn smooth by those who came to see, or were brought to see. I noticed small objects placed at the base of some stakes, broken combs, torn scraps of parchment, a ring, tokens, offerings, or warnings, and above all the wind. It moved gently through the iron, creating a song, a cold, metallic whisper, not mournful, not angry, just patient. You wouldn't survive this, because we need graves to feel real. And these are worse than graves. They don't bury the dead. They hold the living. I turned to leave, but something pulled my eyes back. Near the center of the garden stood a tree, a real one, leafless, gnarled, its bark darkened by years of shadow, and hanging from its limbs, like fruit spoiled before ripening, were chains. Old, heavy, some broken, others knotted. I walked closer. At its base, there was no name, only a single word scorched into the soil. Remember. And I did. I remembered every face I'd passed in the halls, every cry I'd heard through the stone walls, every nod, every silence, every breath held too long. And I understood. This was not a place of punishment. It was a place of permanence. No one was truly buried in the Iron Garden. They were planted, rooted, watched. You wouldn't survive this, because the most terrifying prisons are the ones that let you walk away, but never let you leave. I walked back toward the castle, and the wind followed me. Not cold, not warm, just iron. They told me not to look up, not with words. No one dared speak openly of that place, but with glances, with the sudden hush that fell whenever we passed beneath its crooked silhouette. Servants would walk faster when the tower came into view. Even the soldiers avoided its doors. There was no official decree, no sign, no posted guards, and yet it was understood, somewhere between superstition and law, that those who entered the widow's tower seldom came back quite the same. And sometimes they didn't come back at all. But I was summoned. You wouldn't survive this, because your curiosity would drag you in long before the summons came. The ascent began just before sunset. A soldier I'd never seen before, face hidden behind a wolf fur cowl, tapped once on the door of my cell and handed me a lantern. Unlit. No words, no gesture, just the flame's absence. A ritual of sorts. We stepped into the courtyard. The wind had shifted since morning, blowing in from the east, carrying with it the scent of wet moss and something sharper, something metallic. The castle loomed behind us like a brooding parent, but it was the tower ahead that drew all the weight of my breath. Its stone was darker than the rest of the fortress, older, rougher, as though carved from a quarry the earth itself had since abandoned. Ivy clung to the lower walls, brittle and blackened, and narrow windows watched the world with the quiet judgment of 1,000 years. At the base, a wooden door, plain, no handle, The soldier knocked once. It opened inward on its own. You wouldn't survive this, because your fear would make you hesitate, and hesitation is a scent that spreads fast. The inside smelled of lavender and ash. The spiral staircase was tight, forcing us into single file. The soldier behind me now, his boots falling silent on the stone, as though even he respected the hush. The lantern remained dark in my hand, yet somehow I could see. A faint glow radiated from the walls themselves, soft and bluish, like moonlight trapped behind frost. There were no torches, no sconces, just stone and the sound of our breathing. The climb felt endless, but then suddenly, it ended. We reached a landing. A door stood before me, slightly ajar. The soldier did not follow. He stopped one step below, head bowed, motionless. I understood. Whatever happened now was mine alone. I pushed the door open. The room was round, windowless, and warm. Surprisingly warm. At its center sat a woman. She wore black. Not the black of morning, but the black of ink, of deep water, of something meant to swallow light. Her hair was silver, not gray, not white, but polished silver tied back with a red ribbon that looked almost wet in the flickering candlelight. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, and her eyes, those eyes, held no malice, no kindness, no threat. Only knowledge. She gestured to the chair opposite hers. I sat. You wouldn't survive this, because the silence here is not empty. It listens. It remembers. And eventually, it speaks. She asked no questions. Instead, she told me about myself, my birthplace, my father's name, the injury I'd once hidden from the guards. She recited each fact with the serenity of someone listing ingredients from a long-forgotten recipe. I said nothing. She didn't seem to need my words, only my stillness. When she paused, it wasn't for breath, it was for effect. Then she asked, "Do you know why he allows you to live?" I blinked. She smiled. It was not a warm smile. "It is not because you are useful," she continued. "It is because you are curious, and curiosity, when left hungry, becomes obedient." She stood and walked to a shelf. Books, bones, bottles. She pulled one item, an old scroll, and unrolled it on the table. Symbols I did not recognize marked its surface. Half letters, spirals, things that looked like both writing and wounds. "You will copy this, Shai," she said. "Every day. Until you remember it." I didn't ask what it meant. I didn't ask what happened if I failed. She didn't say. She didn't need to. You wouldn't survive this, because the worst tortures are not physical. They are assignments without answers, tasks without end, roles you never asked for, but must now perform flawlessly. She dismissed me with a wave of her hand. The soldier outside was waiting. The walk down the spiral stairs was silent, but something had changed. The air felt thinner. My knees ached, and in my mind, that scroll unfurled again and again, its symbols twitching just behind my eyelids. Back in my cell, I finally lit the lantern. The flame flickered red, then blue, then settled into white, and I knew I would return to the Widow's Tower. Not tomorrow, not next week, but again, and again, and again. You wouldn't survive this, because once the widow speaks your name, you never stop listening. The day I was told to leave the castle, I felt no relief, only suspicion. For in Vlad's realm, exile is not mercy. It is another test, one with longer shadows and colder silence. I was not told where to go, only handed a satchel of stale bread, a water skin, and a folded parchment sealed with wax. The wax bore his insignia, a bat with wings outstretched, its eyes gouged out. A guard led me to the gate. He didn't speak, didn't meet my gaze. And when the doors creaked open and the great threshold of the fortress yawned wide, I understood something that chilled me more than the dawn mist slithering through the trees. The road ahead had no name. You wouldn't survive this, because you'd think the danger ended at the gates. It started like a storybook trail, muddy, narrow, overgrown. Dew clung to the grass, and the air smelled faintly of wild garlic and pine resin. But the deeper I walked, the more the trees closed in, like jaws, like ribs. The path narrowed, the birds fell silent, and a kind of awful hush swallowed the woods whole. I walked for hours. No signs, no forks. Just forward. Then came the marks. At first I thought they were natural. Scratches in bark, strange arrangements of twigs. But soon they grew more deliberate. Symbols, spirals, long vertical lines carved deep into trees in 3s and 7s. Some oozed sap that looked too dark, too thick, almost red. Others had bones tied to them with sinew. Bird bones, or maybe rat. One had a human tooth dangling from a length of black string. And then, just before sunset, I reached the clearing. You wouldn't survive this, because your legs would freeze before your mind understood why. A single stake stood in the center, tall, fresh, splinters still raw at the base, and impaled on it, not a corpse, but a cloak, deep crimson, tattered at the edges, swaying in the wind like the banner of a forgotten army. Beneath it, a pile of rocks shaped into a throne, primitive, cold. Someone or something had been sitting there? Recently. That was when I noticed the wolves. They were silent. 5 of them, at the edge of the trees, all still, all watching. Their eyes didn't glow. There's no growl. They made no sound. But one by one they began to follow. Not chase, just follow. You wouldn't survive this, because you'd run. And running is a mistake. I kept walking, slowly, never looking back too long. I don't know when the howls began, maybe an hour later, maybe 5. They echoed off the cliffs. Sometimes they sounded close, sometimes not so much. Night fell. The moon came late, a pale coin barely scraping the tops of the trees. I tried to rest once, curled beneath an overhang of rock, but I couldn't sleep. Not with the growling in the wind, not with the memory of Vlad's last words to me, though, in truth, he'd said none aloud. Only his eyes had spoken, and they'd said this: "You are never beyond my reach." Eventually, I saw smoke, not thick, not curling skyward like from a fire, but faint, just a whisper above the tree line. I followed it, past a stream that smelled of sulfur, past a patch of earth that had been burned black, and finally I came to a small house, wooden, lopsided, leaning toward the trees as if it had grown tired of standing upright. A woman stood outside, old, face like crumpled parchment, her left eye white with blindness. She didn't speak, but stepped aside as if expecting me. Inside, the walls were covered in symbols, painted, scratched, burned into wood. All of them matched the ones from the trees. She pointed to a mat on the floor. I sat. She handed me a bowl of stew. The meat was unrecognizable, the broth thick. I ate. She placed a hand on my chest and whispered something in a tongue I did not know. Then she spoke, just once in my language. "Keep walking. You wouldn't survive this, because you'd ask too many questions. And in these woods, answers are just another kind of trap." I left before dawn. The wolves were still out there, but they kept their distance. And I walked on, knowing that Vlad's reach did not end at stone walls, nor with the tip of a stake, nor with the silence of a forgotten tower. It walked with you, behind you, within you. Every step forward was still his territory. You wouldn't survive this, because no road leads away from Vlad, only deeper into his shadow. It ended, as all nightmares do, not with a scream, but with silence. A silence so thick you begin to fear your own heartbeat. They led me back to the castle under a sky the color of bruised parchment, clouds swollen with rain that never fell. The guards didn't touch me, didn't bind me, yet I felt shackled nonetheless. Every step toward the throne room was heavier than the last, as though the stone itself resisted my return. Or perhaps it welcomed me, eager to see how much of me was left. We passed the courtyard. The impalements had multiplied, rows and rows of them now, rising like grotesque orchards of flesh and rot. Some victims were freshly added, others mere bones. I did not avert my gaze. That was a lesson learned long ago. Vlad respected the eyes of those who dared to see. It was the flinching he punished most. Inside, the great hall was empty, except for him. You wouldn't survive this, because you'd expect applause, or forgiveness, or a reason. There are none. He sat at the far end alone, the high-backed chair, not quite a throne, but something worse. A seat that said, "I do not need gold to rule you. I need only time." His fingers drummed the armrest slowly, methodically. No music, just rhythm, a pulse of his own making. I stepped forward, the echo of my boots too loud in that vast space. When I reached the foot of the dais, I knelt. Not from loyalty, not from fear, but because something ancient in my bones understood that standing was no longer an option. He rose. He walked toward me, not fast, not slow, like a man with all the time in the world. When he stopped, he didn't look down at me. He looked through me, as if I were glass and memory all at once. "You have returned," he said. It was not a question. I nodded. He held something in his hand. At first, I thought it was a bundle of dried vines, twisted and dark. But as he raised it, I saw the thorns, long, metallic, some still tipped with rusted blood. It was a crown, but not the kind worn by kings, the kind worn by survivors. He placed it in my hands. "You wouldn't survive this, because you'd try to wear it. Take this," he said, "and remember." That was all. No ceremony, no guards, no decree of rank or reward. Just those words. I rose. He turned, and just before he disappeared into the shadows of the hall, he added, "Those who endure are not honored. They are tested again." I left the castle at dawn. The mist clung to my boots like old regrets. I walked, not away, not toward, but through. Through forests, villages, ruins. Through memory and nightmare. The crown never left my hands. I could not bring myself to wear it, yet I could not discard it either. It was mine now, as was the silence, as was the fear. You wouldn't survive this, because you think stories end. They don't. They just wait for you to stop telling them. In a quiet room, in a quiet village, I now speak softly to those who still listen. I tell them tales of a man they call a monster. I tell them how darkness can wear a face and still smile. I tell them that survival is not triumph. It is obedience, stretched thin over broken will. And sometimes when the fire is low, I hear the wolves, still following. You wouldn't survive the reign of Vlad the Impaler, but somehow, I did.